a class that was taking their final exam in the college lecture hall, and several hundred students there, and they're furiously writing until finally the professor says, "Okay, time's up, put down your pencils and turn your papers in." So immediately all the kids got up, filed down front, and laid their exams on the table down in front of the lecture hall, except for one kid. He kept writing. And several times the professor said, "Son, I'm sorry, but time's up. You've got to turn your paper in." Well, he wasn't ready. He kept on writing. And so after about 10 minutes, and the professor's getting more and more angry, finally the kid got finished, put his pencil down, and came and went to hand in his... The professor said, No, I called time. I can't accept that exam. You fail this class." And the kid looked at him, kind of bowed up a little bit, and said, "Do you know who I am?" And that kind of startled the professor a little bit. He said, "Why, no." And the kid said, "I didn't think so." And he put his exam in the stack and mixed all the papers up and left. Sometimes it's good to be anonymous. That was kind of my philosophy all through school, is just be as anonymous as possible. But that doesn't work for us most of the time. It doesn't work for all of us a lot of the time. We're in the midst today of an epidemic of loneliness. You don't have to spend a lot of time on Google to recognize and get data that shows that we are a lonely people today. One recent study by Cigna Health found 61% of Americans admit to being lonely. And a study by the British Office for National Statistics found among 16 to 24% year olds, that's the group that said that they were the most lonely, 16 to 24-year-olds. But then at the other end of the spectrum, the World Health Organization says that loneliness is epidemic among elderly people. So whether you're a young adult or an older adult, we struggle with this idea of loneliness. And then I ran across a Japanese epidemic, they use the word, of what's called kodokushi, which is lonely deaths, people that die and they're not found for weeks or months after they die. People are so isolated and cut off, they can die in total isolation. We are lonely. We suffer from, we have so many connections. I mean, we can pick up our phone and we have all kinds of friends on Facebook and we're following all kinds of folks on TikTok and Instagram, but we have very few real connections with people. I heard Rick Ashley one time talking about the difference between the way that is with men and women, how more isolated men are. And he said, women generally have connections at various levels, while the average American man has a hard time finding 6 guys to serve as pallbearers. I think all of us, it's interesting that maybe we should turn this into a hymn. It's a philosophy that was expressed by the theme song of an old television sitcom. But in reality, it speaks about the church and the importance of the church, so we can just left this song out of its context and apply it to the church today.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. You want to go where people know people are all the same. You want to go where everybody knows your name.
That is a marvelous apology for church, apologetic for church, where we want to be where we can know people are all the same. That's what God calls us to be. So maybe we could just change the location there and make that a hymn about our connections together. Last week we began a study of the Gospel of Luke. where we're looking at different themes in the book of Luke and just looking at some of the things that Luke stresses more than the rest of the gospel writers, things that stand out in the book of Luke. And what we suggested is that Luke is interested in showing that the gospel is for all, that he focuses on stories that show that Jesus has interest in the poor, he has interest in outcasts. He highlights stories where Jesus interacts with women and children and different groups that are often overlooked, and emphasize that Jesus is not just the Savior of the whole world, he came to be the Savior of everyone in it. Today we're going to look at what he says about Jesus' interest in each individual. Last week we ended with this slide, the gospel is for all, or it's not the gospel at all. And the emphasis we made was, okay, if your understanding of the gospel has God more interested in one group of people than he is in another group of people, if God is interested in one nation more than another nation, one set of people in the nation more than any other set, if your understanding of the gospel is that your group is more valued by God than any other group, then you've misunderstood the gospel. That the message of the gospel is that Jesus came to save the world, but he came to save every individual in the world. And that's the emphasis that we want to look at this morning. How Luke, in the stories that he tells, in the things that he chooses to emphasize more than the other writers, he's stressing the individual worth and importance of each individual to God. That Jesus is not just the Savior of the whole world, but of every single person in it. There's a word, that expression in Luke that's used that our English translations succeed in hiding pretty well, and that is illustrated. Just going to give one example of this. This is the introduction of the parable of the banquet. Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests." Okay, what is significant? Well, he's going to tell a story about the guy who invites all these honored guests. They don't come. And so he goes out into the highways and byways and invites the strangers and the crippled and the lame. They come. And so the point of the parable is that the very people that you didn't expect to be at the banquet, those are the ones who are going to be there. And the ones that you expected to be at the banquet, they're not going to be there. But the expression that he uses in Luke, it stands out in Luke. It's not just a man, it's a certain man. All right. Now, he uses that expression 14 times. Matthew and Mark use it once each. And so when he talks about people, he stresses it's a certain person that's involved. So, examples. As Jesus stepped ashore, a certain man from the town met him. There's the story, we call him the demoniac of the Gerasenes. Luke calls him a certain man. In Luke 10 and verse 30, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, the beginning of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the rich fool. And then he told them this story, the form of a certain rich man. And then Luke 16 and verse 19, Jesus said there was a certain rich man, that begins the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So what does that mean? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe I'm just making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe that's just an expression that Luke liked. But he keeps using it. And I think he keeps using it to introduce us to the idea that Jesus is interested not just in the multitudes that followed him, but the certain people, the certain men and certain women in those multitudes that he has been sent to seek and to save. And we see that illustrated, that emphasis in the individual in several different ways. First, in the parables. There are 19 parables that are unique to Luke. That is, that Luke includes that the other gospel writers don't. And so these are very familiar parables. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the rich fool that we just mentioned, and the parable of the prayer of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And what these have in common is that they stress individual people and their importance to God. Let's just look at just one. It takes place in a context of a story where Jesus is eating with a rich Pharisee. His name is Simon, and so very creatively we usually refer to him as Simon the Pharisee. And Jesus, Jesus eats with anybody. He got in trouble for eating with tax collectors and sinners, but he ate with Pharisees as well. And so he's eating, and while he's eating, there's a disturbance in the banquet. A woman comes in off the street, and she has a reputation in the town of being a sinful woman. Everybody knows that she is a sinful woman, and she comes in and begins to weep and wets the feet of Jesus and dries his feet with her hair. You see, when you throw your banquet in the courtyard of your house out in public, you might expect there to be gate crashers to come in. And that's what happens. This woman comes in, and she's not focused on the meal. She's not focused on the guest. She's focused on Jesus and on her need for him. And this disgusts Simon the Pharisee. And so in verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know that is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So he's mad at the woman for coming in and disrupting but he's particularly angry at Jesus. If Jesus knew the kind of woman this was, well, he wouldn't allow her to do this. Jesus uses this as a teachable moment, and he begins to tell a parable that explains why it is, not only that this woman is responding like she is, but the reason that Jesus is glad to receive it. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon reluctantly, grudgingly answers, well, the one who forgave more. And Jesus says, bingo. That's the reason this woman is responding the way that she does. She understands unlike you, she understands the depth of her lostness. She understands what her sin means. And so she responds like she does. You can do well to learn from her is the implication of Jesus there. And so this woman Jesus is interested in someone that the culture is not interested at all, this individual that is sinful, and he tells Simon, this is the reason I came, to seek and to save that which was lost. Setting aside the parables, looking at all the miracle stories in Luke, there are 7 miracle stories that Jesus tells, that Luke tells of Jesus that the rest of the gospel writers leave out. So if you want to read the story of the 10 lepers that Jesus healed and only one came back to thank him, that's in Luke. And the story of the raising of the son of the widow of Nain, that story is in Luke. And then the servant of the high priest who had his ear cut off because either Peter was such a great swordsman that he had ultimate control to slice off the ear, or he was such a lousy swordsman that all he could get a hold of was an ear. But Jesus takes the time to reattach and heal. And then there's the story of the thief on the cross, but we'll get to that in a moment. So these stories emphasize, again, the individual importance of these people to Jesus. How he turns aside the multitudes and singles out one person, the one leper that comes back. Or he interrupts his travel to interrupt this funeral and raise back to life this widow. Let's pick one of those stories. This is the story of Jesus healing a crippled woman. For 18 years, she could not stand up, and she's crippled. And he sees her in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. And so he takes compassion on her, and he heals her. And of course, everybody is elated. This great miracle takes place. That's not the way it works. The guy that's in charge of the synagogue is outraged that Jesus would do this work on the Sabbath day. And he did it in the synagogue. And so he grumbles and complains, hey, there's 6 days that you can do miracles. Think about that. Griping about the day on which somebody invokes the power of God in a miraculous, well, you didn't do it on the right day. Well, that's what he does. And so Jesus responds, you hypocrites. You see, the ruler of the synagogue is outraged. Jesus can do outrage pretty well as well. Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what has bound her? Yeah, Jesus is not interested in how the rabbis and fathers have parsed the Sabbath day rules so that they know exactly what's allowed and what's not allowed on the Sabbath. How you could go a certain distance, but you couldn't go one step further. How you could do some things, but you couldn't do others. He's not interested in those rules and regulations that humans have come up with. He's interested in people. And so what he sees is this woman who has been bound by Satan. And Luke's telling of the story, there's a demonic aspect here. She's possessed or she's impacted by an evil spirit that's caused this lameness. And he sees that and he wants to heal her. And then he sees the pettiness of the other people who are more outraged that he's broken some of the rules than if he's helped. You treat your animals better than you treat this woman who is a daughter of Abraham. Jesus has come to seek and to save the lost. And then we have 8 encounters. Jesus is going along and he comes into contact with somebody that he deals with that are fairly the story of Mary and Martha. You know how Mary is paying attention to Jesus and Martha is getting ready for lunch. That story is in Luke. The thief on the cross, as I mentioned earlier, is in Luke. And then the Emmaus Road, where these 2 disciples, all of a sudden Jesus joins them. They don't even know quite who he is. And then there's a story of Zacchaeus. Jesus is pressed by the multitudes, and he sees this one guy up in the tree. Let's look at that one for just a second. Jesus is going to, or maybe through Jericho, and the crowds are pressing, and he looks up, and what he sees up in the tree is a short little guy, Zacchaeus. Started to ask the worship leaders to do the Zacchaeus song, the wee little man, that one, maybe not. But what Jesus notices in a wee little man, he notices a tax collector that has a reputation in the town. See, the tax collectors got wealthy, but they got wealthy overcharging their fellow Jews. They worked for the Roman occupation force. So here was a guy that was wealthy, and yet he's interested in Jesus. And of all the multitude, Jesus looks up and sees him and says, "Come down, I'm going to your house. You're going to feed me lunch." Jesus invites himself over like that several different times, but to Zacchaeus' house. Now you think that it's only the Pharisees that grumble and complain when Jesus eats with somebody they don't approve of. But all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." See, this is the guy that got rich off of their backs, and here Jesus is showing him time and attention, this individual sinner. Now, we mentioned last week that sometimes we read a story and we wonder why it is that Luke or the gospel writers don't give us more information. I would love to know the conversation that led about this change in Zacchaeus. I mean, they're sitting down at lunch and they're having lunch conversation, and all of a sudden Zacchaeus jumps up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus is interested in this individual that anybody else would have said goes in that category of sinners that you can just give up on. And he spends time, Luke focuses on him and tells us that he comes to this aha moment where he repents and wants to make everything right. And Jesus explains why that's important in the next 2 verses. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." Sounds just like the crippled woman. He's worthwhile. And then he goes on, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The very reason that Jesus came to earth was to pursue people that everyone else thought would have been a lost cause. And those are the kinds of stories that Luke, he tells some of the same stories you find in Matthew, Mark, and John, but the one that Luke focuses on specifically seems to focus on the worth and the importance of individuals. Rubel Shelley tells the story of a Soviet-era Russian poet named Vladimir Solokin. He wrote a piece in a Russian literary journal very carefully. Now, this is back 10 years before Glasnost and well before the wall fell and the Iron Curtain shattered. So he's writing in this journal, and he's dealing very carefully with the idea of the existence of God. He doesn't call him God, he calls him the supreme reason that explains the universe. And he seems to accept that this supreme reason must indeed exist. He says if you deny the existence of this supreme reason, that would claim that complicated and precise organisms as a flower, a bird, a human being appeared at random, the result of lucky, blind, and unprogrammed combination of chemical elements. And he dismisses that as an impossibility. Sort of makes what we might call the cosmological and a little bit of the teleological argument for the existence of God, arguing there must be a cause of the universe, and then pointing to the complex nature, the design of the universe. He takes that for granted. That's not the question. So he continues, what is the question? The real question is not whether a supreme reason exists, but whether it knows about me and has anything to do with me. Yes, there has to be a great power that created the universe, a first cause that caused everything, a reason that explains why we're here. That's not the question, he says. The question is, does that supreme reason know anything or care anything about me? And Luke's resounding answer is yes. The one who spoke the universe into existence, the one who still sustains the universe by the power of his might, is not so busy keeping Jupiter in place or the Milky Way spinning in the right way, not to care about you and about me as individuals. David talked about this long ago in Psalm 139 when he said, "You search me, O Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways." God knows everything about it. David says, you know when I sit and when I rise. We don't know when to do that except when Katie tells us to, but God knows when we do that. He's spinning the Milky Way around, but he knows when you get up and when you lie down. He knows what you're thinking. Sometimes my wife looks at me and tells me, I know what you're thinking. She usually does, but God always does, right? But you see, as David, if you look at the psalm, David's not completely sure. He thinks this is all a good thing. So he continues in verse 5, you hem me in, entrap me, behind and before, and you lay your hand on me. And then verse 7, he continues, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my beds in the depth of the sea, you are there. And he continues, no matter where I go, God knows. He knows who I am, what I'm doing. He has knowledge of me. And sometimes that's annoying. When you were kids and you'd get in the bed and you'd throw the covers over your head, that way the monsters didn't know you were there. You can't throw your covers over your head and God doesn't know. Ask Jonah about how hard it is to try to hide from God, because no matter where you go, there he is. And here's the important thing to keep in mind. Here's the thing that Luke is driving home in all of these stories about how interested Jesus is in individual people. God knows us from afar. We can't go anywhere and he's not there. He knows our thoughts. He knows everything about us. And he loves us just the same. He knows our flaws and our weaknesses and our mistakes. He knows that no matter how, when we put on a mask and pretend like everything is fine and we tell people at church, oh, I'm just fine. And he knows in our hearts we're struggling. He knows those weaknesses and those struggles, and he still loves us. that Christ came to seek and to save that which was lost. And that's you and me. In the mass of humanity that God so loved the world, he loves each and every one of us individually and personally. The one who created and spoke the universe into existence loves us so much that he'd rather die than spend eternity without us. And that's the message of the cross.